Thank you, Industrial Heat Treating and Yokogawa, for asking me to discuss the Nadcap process and try to touch upon some of the pyrometry issues within Nadcap and kind of go over the whole Nadcap process. I could probably spend more than an hour doing this, but I'll try to do my due diligence in the hour allotted here. What I plan on trying to cover today is what is Nadcap and the Nadcap process. I'd like to dive in a little bit into the Nadcap checklist, especially the AC 7102/H, which is pyrometry, and go into some of the top pyrometry non-conformances. Also, I'd like to discuss some of the Heattreat supplier advisories as it pertains to pyrometry. Also have a little bit of discussion about the Heattreat Audit Handbook, as well as the Pyrometry Reference Guide. And then we'll talk about some of the instrument requirements as it pertains to AMS 2750, especially since there's new requirements that have started as of July of 2015. So briefly, what is Nadcap? Nadcap was developed as a industry-managed program to improve compliance and quality while reducing costs throughout the aerospace and commercial industries. PRI is responsible for administering the Nadcap program and has done so since 1990. Originally, it was Nadcap, as the acronym was National Aerospace and Defense Contractors Accreditation Program, and the name was changed to just plain Nadcap to reflect the global aerospace industry. Nadcap conducts audits to special processes such as heat treating, chem processing, welding, non-destructive testing, materials test labs, coatings, composites, conventional machining, non-conventional machining, surface enhancements, non-metallic materials manufacturing, and non-metallic materials testing and sealants. Nadcap is always looking for more special processes to address and add as a commodity. They're always evolving in that way. Subscribing primes that require or recognize Nadcap, as you can see from this slide, there's quite a few. Didn't capture every single one of them, but major aerospace players such as Airbus, Boeing, Lockheed, Rolls-Royce, Safran, GE Aviation, the U.S. military also are subscribers to the Nadcap accreditation process. Nadcap special processes are made up of task groups, and in the Heattreat task group, they speak for the needs of the global aerospace community and the organizations in promoting teamwork, facilitating consensus, focusing on quality, ensuring that the Nadcap program is robust and technically representative. It comprises of all the representatives from the subscribing primes. They provide oversight to completed Nadcap audits. In other words, they authorize the supplier's accreditation as well as an audit failure. They also help construct checklists and training materials for the auditors as part of their duties. The Nadcap heat treating process has developed the Audit Checklist 7102 and the associated slash sheets checklist, which address the following. They address metal systems such as various alloys. They also address the heat treating process, normalizing, annealing, carburizing. They also touch upon the heat treating equipment such as the furnaces, ovens, includes refrigeration and quench systems, deals with pyrometry, instrumentation, and atmosphere controls. It also deals with brazing, hot forming, and hot isostatic pressing. The Nadcap checklist for heat treating is broken down into several checklists. They have the AC 7102, which is the baseline checklist. The baseline checklist is composed of 72 pages, 14 pages dedicated to yes-no questions, and pages 15 through 72 are dedicated to conducting the actual job audits. The various checklists that are invoked will be depending on what your special process that you're being accredited for, what types of heat treating. As you can see, you have brazing, aluminum, carburizing, nitriting, hardness and conductivity, hipping, induction hardening, pyrometry sintering, and localized heat treating. You also have the /S checklist, is the supplemental checklist that for the specific aerospace primes. The ones listed here: Rolls-Royce, MTU, GE Aviation, Boeing, Bombardier, Safran, Hamilton, Sunstrand, Raytheon, and Lever Aerospace all have special questions that need to be answered during a heat treating audit. AC 7102 baseline, the /8 for pyrometry, and the supplemental are always invoked during a heat treat supplier's accreditation. What deals with the Nadcap process and what challenges do a supplier face during the a Nadcap audit? Well, obviously you have the Nadcap checklist, you have supplier advisories, you also have to deal with the Pyrometry reference guide and Heattreat audit handbook, you have customer invoked specifications, you also have the auditor interpretations as well as the PRI staff engineers who's reviewing your sources. Other challenges that I say are self-inflicted are sometimes the lack of resources or lack of commitment from management, inadequate training for personnel, lack of a robust internal auditing system, inadequate processing equipment or test equipment, and also sometimes complacency after maintaining or having Nadcap for quite a while. See suppliers that get complacent after a while, kind of rest on their laurels and kind of forget doing the maintenance issues that they have to do on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis by maintaining their Nadcap accreditations. Well, what is considered a successful Nadcap audit? Well, PRI simply classifies that as a pass or failing. A failed audit is based on the number of non-conformance written and that have been accepted as legitimate by a PRI staff engineer. For an initial audit, this is for an initial accreditation. For a 4-day audit, you can have no more than 8 or more major non-conformances, or a total of 12 or more total non-conformance. That's a mixture of majors and minors. For a reaccreditation audit, and this is for a supplier that's already been accredited, 5 or more major non-conformance can be deemed failed, or 12 or more total non-conformances. So you can see the number drops down considerably from your initial audit, your first go-around with Nadcap versus a reaccreditation. A major nonconformance is interpreted to be a non-sustaining corrective action resulting from any prior Nadcap audit. If it's a product impact is identified or suspected, or if you have a systemic problem where finding is repeatedly seen over different elements of the system. So what are the consequences if you do fail a Nadcap audit? Well, you have 2 options available now for a Nadcap failed audit. The new program put into place within the last year and a half is risk mitigation, which allows the supplier to provide root causes and corrective actions for all the written non-conformances. This is submitted like your normal audit for any kind of NCRs that are written. You go ahead and close out the audit. Originally, this was set up to be done with the Aerospace primes. During the last October meeting, they have now relinquished the risk mitigation back to the staff engineers who will close out your audit. The closure of this failed audit by risk mitigation does not grant you accreditation. This allows you to, once you're done with the risk mitigation process, it will allow you to go back and go for a re-entry audit, maybe rescheduled after it's closed out. Your second option is to refuse risk mitigation, and that will prevent the supplier from re-entering the program for 2 years. And after that 2-year period, you'd be removed from the system. After the 2 years of being in the failed criteria, you're removed from the system and you go back as an initial accreditation audit. Subscribing primes have the right to waive the 2-year re-entry limitation if that's an option. So I'm going to touch upon about the AC 71028 Pyrometry Checklist. This was a new checklist that was issued in January of 2004 2014 as a separate checklist. All the requirements for pyrometry were excised from the checklist, from the baseline checklist. None of the questions were changed from the original when they were in the baseline. It was created to have for other Nadcap commodity groups to adopt the pyrometry requirements. Those who are involved with chemical processing already know that the AC 7108 checklist does have pyrometry requirements. Coatings, weldings, this is also talked about with composites, is pyrometry requirements. Although right now there is an AMS 2750 diet version or /1 being considered for pyrometry control for autoclaves and bondings. That document has not been completed and has not come up to AMEC as of yet, but they are considering a separate checklist or separate pyrometry specification for composites. As of today, there is no other Nadcap commodity that has invoked the 7102/8 checklist. Well, I'm going to go over some of the top pyrometry non-conformances as brought out by PRI. These are always seem to be reoccurring out of most of the audits. Normally, 8 of the top 10 findings are pyrometry related, besides job audit questions. And these were some of the top pyrometry non-conformances, such as internal procedures for pyrometry addressing all the aspects of 2750 or customer specifications. Do instrument calibration records and stickers show conformance to the requirements of 2750 or stringent customer requirements? Do thermocouples and thermocouple wires meet the calibration frequency, temperature intervals, and accuracy requirements of 2750? Are the instrument calibration accuracy and frequencies in accordance with the requirements of 2750? Does documentations of the performed TUS include as minimum all the reporting requirements described in 2750, paragraph 3521-1, items A through Q? Are SATs performed on the temperature control and recording systems required by the applicable instrumentation type in each control zone for each piece of equipment? Do calibration of primary, secondary, standard, and field test instruments meet the requirements of 2750? And do TUS results meet the requirements of all applicable specifications for each individual piece of thermal equipment? And does the TUS procedure conform to the requirements of AMS 2750? I'm going to touch upon each one of these real quick and maybe give you some hints to succeed on these non-conformances. So first of all, you have the one that I call as the top pyrometry related question. And this deals with the internal procedure for pyrometry addressing all the aspects of AMS 2750 and or other customer requirements. Heattreat suppliers should be aware that the requirements of AMS 2750 and aerospace prime pyrometry requirements. There are several aerospace primes that have their own requirements, such as GE Aviation with the P10 TF3. You have Rolls-Royce RPS 953, and this is Rolls-Royce Derby versus Rolls-Royce Allison, which is Indianapolis-based. They have adopted AMS 2750. Bombardier Beargen 007 is a pyrometry specification, as well as the Safran Group has PR 0011. This is really a catch-all checklist question where a Nadcap auditor can write any non-conformance for any violation of AMS 2750, even if there's not a specific Nadcap checklist question associated with. So this is one of those catch-all questions that your procedure must be robust enough to cover all the requirements of AMS 2750, as well as all of your prime requirements as well. Do instrument calibration records and stickers show conformance to the requirements of 2750 or more stringent customer requirements? AMS 2750, paragraph 326.1 is very explicit of what a calibration sticker requires, as well as paragraph 3262 gives you strict requirements of what documentation requirements. Most of the time when we see non-conformance written against these this checklist question, it usually has to deal with something just simple as missing from the documentation. For instance, with the calibrations of multi-channel recording instruments, they might not have a limitation or restriction sticker associated with it. For instance, you have a 12-channel recorder, but you're only utilizing 5 of the channels for data acquisition. You should have some sort of limitation restrictions that says that instrumentation is only limited to those 5 channels. Something very simple that can be posted up on your instrument panels in your paperwork that says you have a limitation restriction. Likewise, that would be in the same thing with the certification. You're required to have a limitation or restrictions on a piece of equipment. That is one of the reasons why you see this NCR. Also, the biggest one we've seen is also failed for the quality organization to review and sign the calibration reports. Very simple task to do, but it generates a lot of NCRs within the Heattreat audits. Do thermocouples and thermocouple wires meet the calibration frequencies, temperature intervals, and accuracy requirements of 2750 or more stringent customer requirements? AMS 2750, Table 1 describes sensors and sensor calibrations, covers the types of sensors that are used, uses of the sensors, what the calibration period and traceability requirements are. It also gives you the accuracy requirements. One thing I always try to warn suppliers with Nadcap, when you're dealing with the thermocouples, make sure that you're looking at a lot of the footnotes. You don't want to ignore the footnotes that are within the specifications under these tables, because they have information that needs to be utilized for procedure writing. 2750E was broken out with this figure 1, explains the reuse and recalibration of various types of sensors. The new version of 2750E was added quite a few figures within the specification to help explain things a little bit further. You also have to be aware that prime aerospace pyrometry requirements shall be reviewed as well and incorporated into procedures when applicable. Next top pyrometry non-conformance would be is calibration accuracy and frequencies in accordance with requirements of 2750, and again, more stringent customer requirements. Table 3 does a great job of describing instruments and instrument calibration requirements. It talks about the reference, primary, and secondary standards. Also talks about field test equipment that you would use for temperature uniformity survey, system accuracy test, calibrations of process instrumentation. Talks about the accuracy requirements for control, recording, monitoring instruments, frequencies, and uses. Again, be aware that these Table 3 includes quite a few footnotes that need to be incorporated when necessary. Again, prime aerospace pyrometry requirements need to be incorporated when applicable. For example, here GE P10 TF3 requires an accuracy of the instrumentation to be plus or minus 2, whereas 2750 says the same thing, or plus or minus 0.2% of reading, whichever is greater. When you are developing your procedures, you always want to go to the tightest tolerance that you're required to by customers. The documentation on performed for TUS include the minimum, paragraph 3521, items A through Q. Again, 2750 is very clear on what needs to be in calibration reports, uniformity reports, and system accuracy test reports. And for some reason, some of these items get omitted and generate NCRs. One of the ones that we've seen that gets generated a lot is item D, which is a time and temperature data from all recorded sensors required for furnace instrumentation type for all zones tested. This would mean the furnace recording showing either the control sensor and applicable any load sensors or high and low sensors. In other words, what you need to do when you're after you've completed a temperature uniformity survey, you need to print up the furnace chart and put it with the survey packet. We're looking to make sure that all the process sensors, if you have type C instrumentation, which records the high and low sensors in the furnace, that those are being documented as well. If your furnace is type B, which utilizes that load sensor, that is also within the uniformity as well. Item G, again, from what we've seen from non-conformances, is not collecting the data. When you collect the data, you just have to identify the readings as either corrected or uncorrected data. Items K and L, again, when you start your survey time and end your survey time, just a simple miss where people might miss that requirement needs to be put in there. Again, very simple things to clean up to not generate NCRs, unnecessary NCRs. Also a summary of the corrected plus or minus of the TUS readings at each survey temperature after stabilization. And again, one of the biggest ones we've seen is item Q, which is supplier's quality organization approval. Someone from quality needs to sign off on these certifications and accept them. Is an SAT performed and the temperature control and recording systems required by the applicable instrumentation type in each control zone, each piece of thermal processing equipment used for production heat treatment? 2750-341 describes what the requirements for SATs is. Again, most omitted items include failure to perform and document an SAT on recording sensors. This includes your high and low sensors or the sensors. Failure to perform the SAT on load thermocouples. Failure to perform a conventional SAT or failure to apply the alternate SAT. Failure to perform the SAT after replacement of sensors, replacement of process instrumentation, or recalibration adjustment of control or recording instruments. Not performing the SAT at the required frequency in accordance with AMS 2750, Table 6 or 7. Does the calibration of the primary instrumentation, secondary standard, or field test instrument meet the requirements of 2750? Again, what's being missed on some of these requirements is the minimum and maximum of the test instrument needs to be calibrated, the minimum and maximum of the range, and 4 equal points in between. What's happening is the test instrument being utilized is not maybe calibrated by the range and may cause a non-conformance. The other issue is failure to calibrate the instruments on all the thermocouple input types to be used. Failure to calibrate all the channels or groups of channels for intended use. This would be for your temperature uniformity meters to make sure that if you're using a multi-point recorder, obviously for doing a uniformity, that each channel or groups of channels are calibrated or for the intended use. And for test instruments that are calibrated in the field, the test instrument does not meet the secondary standard accuracy or frequencies allowed by AMS 2750. What we see here is you're allowed to use field test equipment to calibrate other field test equipment, but the field test instruments being used to calibrate must meet the accuracies of secondary standard and are held to a tighter frequency of calibration, which is every 3 months, versus your normal secondary standards have to be calibrated on an annual basis. Another non-conformance top pyrometry finding is, do the TUS results meet the requirements of all applicable specifications for each thermal processing? Again, what we see here is the TUS not meeting applicable process specification. If you have a plus or minus 10 furnace and you are certifying it to plus or minus 15, or work is going into a furnace that should have been plus or minus 10 and goes into a plus or minus 15 furnace, that would generate obviously an NCR. TUS does not meet specific aerospace prime requirements. Example, Bombardier requires a comparison check between TUS sensors and sensors that represent the known hottest and coldest locations. You have to do this comparison test between your highs and low thermocouples that are permanently mounted in the sensor in the furnace against the TUS sensors, and this comparison check must be done every 5 minutes during a uniformity survey and compared to those readings. Another example would be 2770, which is the heat treatment of aluminum alloys. You have a requirement for lag time recovery requirements that may not be in compliance again. This is not necessarily a pyrometry function, but it is requirement in a process specification. Other non-conformances that are generated through this checklist question are overshoot of the process or TUS sensors. So, having a good control system that has great tuning parameters that are to slow down your approach, so you don't have any overshoot of your test thermocouples nor of your process sensors. Also, heat sink design is not in compliance with the requirements of AMS 2750, paragraph 3510.1. Very explicit of what the heat sinks are allowed to be, no more than a half-inch thickness in cross-section and no thicker than the finished parts that you process in your furnace. Also, does the TUS procedure conform to the requirements of 2750 or more stringent customer requirements? Again, some of the most omitted items are not including aerospace prime requirements, such as, an example here again, P10 TF3 requires all periodic TUSs to be conducted at the lowest and highest temperatures of a furnace qualified operating range. In other words, this is an initial survey, and they require basically an initial survey every time you do, if you're processing for GE Aviation. Their furnaces require an initial survey that covers the high and low of each of your qualified operating ranges. Another recent instance we've seen was referencing obsolete requirements or specifications. I'm not sure a lot of you know, but Boeing has had 3 different pyrometry requirements, 3 different pyrometry specifications, BAC 5621, DPS 1.700, and PS 23401, depending on which Boeing sandbox you were playing with. But now across all Boeing enterprises, have now allowed you to adopt AMS 2750 as your pyrometry testing requirements. If your procedure still reference Boeing pyrometry requirements, you may be held to having NCRs written against you because you do still reference those specifications, and that means you would still have to comply with them. We recently were helping a customer that had 3 non-conformances written because in 3 different procedures they referenced Boeing specifications, even though they had adopted AMS 2750 as their pyrometry requirements. Also, having procedures that are not adequately descriptive to capture the equipment qualified operating temperatures or the qualified work zones or the frequencies of the TUS. Again, having robust, complete procedures will help you eliminate some of these NCRs. Next, I want to kind of touch upon the Heattreat supplier advisories, because these advisories provide some clarifications to issues that have risen during various Nadcap audits. These advisories also become a part of the interpretation of AMS 2750, as well as aerospace prime requirements and expectations during the audit. Supplier advisories are always updated when needed and are available to the Nadcap subscribers at eAudit.net. You have to recognize with these advisories, during a Nadcap audit, the non-conformance can be written against heat treat supplier advisories, Pyrometry Reference Guide, and the Heat Treating Handbook. I'm going to touch upon some of the pyrometry advisories that have been released in the last couple of years. With the first one here with the HT 1304, basically this advisory was written, it concerns more for outside pyrometry service providers who have test equipment that is calibrated in a wider range than is needed for a particular supplier. For example, if you go into a facility and calibrate a controller that has a range of 200 to 500 degrees, but the outside pyrometry supplier's test instrument was calibrated from 0 to 2400 degrees, it's obviously outside the requirements of AMS 2750. So there's giving some latitude towards the outside service providers that their instruments can be outside the ranges because they may be covering other types of instrumentation for other different clients. With HT 1305, which deals with calibration stickers, this advisory came out because of this day and age. You may have control panels that have maybe several different types of controllers on a panel, or you may have a PLC type system that may be running several pieces of equipment. They're allowing some latitude with putting the stickers up on the panel that identifies, not necessarily having a individual calibration sticker for each furnace that PLC may be controlling, but one that identifies that PLC has been calibrated and some kind of reference to the certification that says this, that shows the compliance that the instrument meets tolerances, and if there's any kind of limitations or restrictions, it also gives some latitude, making sure that these stickers are visible to the heat treat personnel to validate the status of the equipment. 1309 was TUS furnace data, and this one came out where NCRs were generated when customers were utilizing more than one load thermocouple to process their work. Let's say a supplier decided to use 3 or 4 load thermocouples during their heat treat cycles, and NCRs were being generated because they weren't putting 3 or 4 load thermocouples in during the uniformity survey as required to do for your instrumentation type. So it was this supplier advisory was written to allow for, if you use multiple load thermocouples during your processing, but during a uniformity survey, the requirement is to only list 1 load thermocouple. So again, it's giving some latitude and some explanation of what the intent of 2750 is and what the expectation for the heat treat auditor to audit to. Advisory 14-0, this basically came out of, again, this advisory came out because there was a flaw within the Pyrometry Reference Guide at the time, as well as there were several furnace manufacturers that were making statements that you're allowed to use process recorders, multi-channel process recorders, to also conduct your temperature uniformity surveys. AMS 2750, paragraph 3520-1, was very clear that you were not allowed to use process instrumentation to conduct uniformity surveys. But the Pyrometry Reference Guide allowed for an individually calibrated channel to conduct your SATs. So the concern was, if we're not allowing the process recorders to conduct uniformity surveys as a test instrument, why would we allow the process recorder to also conduct SATs? So they revised the Pyrometry Reference Guide to disallow that and sent out this supplier advisory. And this latest one, 1505, was for printed TUS reports. This one, again, came out of an NCR was generated because the supplier who was performing their uniformity surveys with an electronic recorder was deleting the original data, but we're printing up the TUS reports. And we allowed, with this advisory, now allows that that's an acceptable practice as long as the TUS data is in printed format. That is now your permanent record. There's no need to keep the electronics record anymore. In this latest advisory, 1602, just recently came out actually of last week, again, regarding PLC-based systems, where a PLC is doing your controlling as well as your recording, and the suppliers were writing down, when they're doing the calibrations, were writing down one temperature reading, even though the signal for the recording was the same, and they were receiving NCRs because of this. So when you have an integrated system like this, as long as you document the one reading and have it proceduralized that it's all as one system, there's no need to write both readings down. I'd like to briefly touch upon the Heattreat Audit Handbook and what it required, or what it means for the heat treating community out there, the suppliers out there. It basically has been written to address specific questions contained in the current revisions of the AC 7102 and helps clarify some of the questions that are audit questions. It's also standardized the audit between auditors. It's also used to standardize definitions and terms during the audit. It provides guidance on the task group expectations relative to the heat treat supplier, the audit preparation, and the execution of the audit. It provides general information on unique requirements of participating prime contractors to aid an auditor in determining if a supplier is conforming to the customer requirements. These audit advisories are now incorporated into the Heattreat Audit Handbook. And this is, again, this Heattreat Audit Handbook obviously is revised quite often, and it's available on eAuditNet. We also have the Pyrometry Reference Guide. Both the Heat Treating Audit Handbook and the Heattreat Pyrometry Reference Guide are written and controlled by the Heattreat Task Group. The Pyrometry Reference Guide was originally established because pyrometry was the least understood during the Heattreat audits, and again, caused of 8 of the 10 NCRs related to pyrometry. It is prepared to improve the understanding of pyrometry and the performance of pyrometric functions. It's a guidance and interpretation of 2750, as well as fundamental pyrometry principles. It does parallel the structure of AMS 2750 and it provides expectations from a Nadcap Heattreat auditor. The one thing you do have to realize is that the pyrometry reference is only a guide and is not intended to replace AMS 2750 or waive any of the requirements. If there's an interpretation issue that you may not agree with and the pyrometry reference guide might be in conflict with it, normally it's best time to step back and maybe give a call into the staff engineers with PRI and get a definite interpretation. If that doesn't go, then you can always contact AMEC for clarification on the intent of the specification. Part of the new requirements in AMS 2750 with instrumentation, all the sunset clauses from AMS 2750D have expired. As of July of you had 3 years after the published date of 2750, which was July of 2012. So as of July of 2015, all instrumentation now must meet the requirements of 2750. So what does that affect on your instruments? Well, now you have chart resolution requirements. If you have the old style pre-printed charts, you're going to have some resolution requirements for recording instruments. You also will have to have verify your print speeds and chart speeds shall be in accordance with 2750. You'll have print interval minimums that will need to be met depending on your temperature cycles. So there's some new hard requirements, or the actual old requirements, but now they're putting into full effect as of July of 2015. Some of the recording instruments, there's been some discussions with various types of recording instruments that have been talked about. So one of the questions that come up is recording instruments that print a digital value for your time and your temperature. So it prints out a digital value on a chart paper. Is it considered a digital recorder or analog? And it's been decided that it is a digital recording, and the requirements of 2750 Table 4 do not apply, which is the readability. Recording instruments that utilize thermal paper, in which the pen mechanism both prints the graph and trace of the chart and has a digital display, is also considered a digital recording. Annual chart speed verification would be required for these recording instruments that use a paper medium. And also 2750 addressed the requirements of wireless systems to address the emerging technologies out there with wireless transmitters, receivers, and associated controls as well. So this slide kind of gives you an idea of what is considered paper medium, what's considered analog and digital. Again, anything pretty much with a pre-printed scale that uses a pen to draw the trace of a graph is going to be considered an analog recorder. Anything that prints out of digital media is digital recording. The next thing we'd like to talk about real quick is the electronic records in AMS 2750. AMS 2750 is clear on, again, what an electronic record is. It creates must basically have to create an electronic record that can't be altered without detection. It must have a software playback utility, so provides a means of examining or compiling the records. Shall not provide any means for altering the source of the data. It shall provide the ability to generate accurate and complete copies of records in both human readable and electronic form suitable for inspection, copying, and reviewing. It also shall be capable of providing evidence the record has been reviewed, such as recording an electronic review or method of printing the record or physical marking. And the highlighted section here is, I have seen NCRs been generated for when a record is printed for review and is in the trend line format. The data now is considered an analog, and all the requirements for analog recording instruments for chart resolution applies. So if you print this data up and do a physical marking on the review, you want to make sure that you do the data in a digital format, and the data would be considered digital. If the data is printed up in the graph format, then you're going to be held to the analog requirements. And the other requirements, you have the protect and retention retrieval of the accurate records throughout retention periods. Hardware and software shall operate through the entire retention period as specified by 2750. So a few of the takeaways that you can hopefully take back from this program: if you perform aerospace special process such as heat treating, chem process, and composites, you more than likely will need to become Nadcap accredited. PRI is the only organization that provides Nadcap accreditations. Biggest thing that I'd like to tell our customers that organization from top to bottom must embrace the idea of Nadcap special process to be successful. Those organizations that kind of see it as a necessary evil or want to put the window dressing on their systems but not embrace it fully tend to struggle through the Nadcap accreditation process. Heat treating and pyrometry always seem to be one of the most challenging Nadcap accreditations. So what's your next step if you decide to want to go for Nadcap? Well, first of all, you need to decide from all levels of your organization if the Nadcap accreditation is right for your company. If you do, you really need to evaluate your entire internal quality system against the requirements for Nadcap special process. You need to look at the quality manual, procedures, work instructions, customer requirements. You need to incorporate all this into your system. You have to review your thermal processing equipment for its capabilities to meet the applicable processing and testing, the pyrometry requirements. You need to perform robust internal audits of your system to drill down on any possible holes within your processing capabilities. And once you've captured all those steps, I guess it would be time to go ahead and schedule your audit and see if you're ready for the PRI experience. Again, thank you for your time, and hopefully be able to pluck a few things out of this in the short time frame that we had here. Thank you.